This story is from my new collection, Thanatrauma. The Way Station, in appreciation of Stefan Grabinski. The decision to attend his father's funeral was hastily made, and he was surprised at his own willingness to go. They had been estranged for decades. Polk had burned all pictures and belongings, reminding him of his father. One day he'd built a grand bonfire in the field behind his house and been gratified by the impressive volume and intensity of the flames. Their beauty and barely controlled passion, the too real possibility of their escape, had almost brought him to tears. But when he received the note from his sister, a trip home felt required. He had no idea how he would get there. He didn't really know anyone in the area. He'd said hello to a few of his neighbors in the 5 years he'd lived in this distant and isolated community, and asked for directions a time or two, but had no friends here, or even anyone he might call, honestly, an acquaintance. Out of necessity, he rang the one neighbor whose name he recalled. "Can you drive me to the train station? I no longer own a car." There was an awkward pause, and then the old man haltingly replied, "I haven't been there in years. Do we still have train service? I believe, well, didn't the station burn down some time ago?" "I have no idea. You can take me there, and if the station is no longer operational, you can bring me back. I will pay you either way, of course. I have familial obligations." "I see, of course, family. I know all about families, the things you have to do, the things which must be tolerated, even beyond the bounds of good taste. I will drive you, and there's no need to pay me. I was looking for an excuse to get away from my own family for a few hours, to see some of the countryside, the freedom of the open road and all that." His neighbor was obviously a fool, but Polk had no choice. The old man arrived in a dusty yellow car, blaring music out the open windows. On the long drive, the neighbor chattered on about a variety of subjects, family life, town gossip, politics, without turning the music down. Polk gazed out at low-lying scrub and malnourished patches of weed and wildflowers. Now and then he spied bits of rusted train track. It was impossible to determine if any of it was still in use. Certainly it looked poorly maintained, but the paths away from a place were often subtle and underutilized. He closed his eyes and was almost asleep when the man's tone changed. "So is it peaceful out where you live?" "I suppose so. I never think about it in those terms." "Well, it's just that no one ever sees you. We thought you must be dead." "I have always lived," Polk considered, then continued, "in a condition of privacy." The old man said no more, and Polk fell asleep. Polk dreamed he boarded the train and subsequently traveled for weeks, following the streams in low-lying river valleys, climbing mountains and dropping down steep, rocky inclines. At the end of the line, he was met by his sister and his father, still alive. Polk woke up as they pulled in front of the dilapidated train station. There were no other cars in the dirt and gravel lot. Portions of the outside of the building were scorched, and a pile of burnt timbers lay near the entrance, but the exterior at least appeared to be intact. There was no one around to ask if the building was still in use. "See, as I remembered, there's been a fire," the neighbor shouted above the music. Polk reached over and turned off the key. The neighbor stared at him. "You can leave me here. I thank you for the ride. But can't you see there's been a fire? There is still a building. I appreciate your concern." Polk felt anxious to get away. He climbed out of the car and walked around to the entrance. He saw no lights on inside, but the door opened easily enough. The sour taste of smoke filled his mouth, but none was visible. At first glance, the interior appeared to be abandoned. Dirt and leaves filled the corners, and the overhead beams were populated with the nests of wasps and small birds. The chalkboard where departures and arrivals were once recorded was blank except for faint, ghostly smears. There was a single bench pushed up against a wall, layered in advertisements and notices many years old. The bench was painted with dust. One side of the building was open, and only a few feet away was the platform and the tracks below. It seemed an unusual arrangement to Polk, that close a proximity to where people would be waiting for their trains, less than safe. Polk felt vaguely annoyed, even though he had fully anticipated this. Not that he actually wanted to make the trip, but he believed in options, even though he never used them. Why was there no closed notice posted either on the outside of the building or somewhere in its interior? There was no way to call anyone. The payphones had been removed, and he did not own a cell. Good enough. He had tried to do the right thing by his dead father, but unavoidable circumstances had prevented it. It was completely out of his control. He would rest for a few moments and then begin the long trek home. Perhaps someone would drive by and he would ask for a lift, but he had no idea what kind of traffic could be expected this late in the day, nor did he have any sense whether he was the kind of person likely to get a ride in this community. He realized he was somewhat scruffy and unkempt. It had been a very long time since he cared about his appearance. Did this make him look dangerous? He had no idea. He dusted off the bench as best he could with his hands, clapping them together afterwards. The dust rose up in puffs so copious, someone might have thought his palms were on fire. He sat down and gazed ahead. The old ticket window was directly in front of him, the filthy glass like a gray filter. He noticed a darker gray area somewhere beyond the glass, a distant murky corner of that room. As his eyes adjusted, that gloomier gray area appeared to enlarge. He couldn't take his eyes away. The strain made the vision wobble ever so slightly. And then out of that obscurity, a face bearing a mustache resolved, fixed above a shabby uniform. Dusky eyes blinked. The pale lips moved. May I help you? He stumbled off the bench and approached the man behind the window. You're open for business? Sporadically, the lips said. When there is a need. Do you have such a need? Where do you wish to go? Somewhere east, there's a funeral. My father has died. Polk thought the information might obtain more sympathetic service. The closest terminal is a 2-hour journey. There you can acquire a ticket to a number of eastern destinations. Well then, that's what I'd like to do. The man took his money and handed him a ticket. Polk thought the price remarkably cheap. You will have a bit of a wait before your train arrives. A number of other trains will pass through. Some will stop and some will not. Your train will be the only one to open its doors. Do you have luggage? Just my book, he said, and pulled a thin volume of poetry out of his coat pocket. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision. I brought nothing else. But the ticket seller had already receded from the window. Polk put his face against the glass to see where the man had gone. But the glass was so grimy and the interior so dim, he couldn't find him. He returned to the bench and sat. After several minutes, he became cognizant of a slight vibration in the bench and a subtle change in the air, as sometimes accompanies an approaching storm front. Then a distant sound that made him want to hurry somewhere, anywhere, but where he was sitting. Then the train was there, filling the gap in that side of the station, traveling too fast, obviously, to stop. Due to an optical effect Polk did not understand, the outside of the train was blurred, but the interior and the passengers moving around in that interior were perfectly clear. What was even more peculiar was the attitudes of those passengers. Many were gathered at the windows, their faces pressed against the glass, looking out, looking at him. He could see others running around inside the cars, as if in a panic, gesturing toward the windows, recruiting more passengers to gather at the windows and gaze at him. By the time the last car arrived, the windows were full of staring faces. Polk had no idea what to make of it. He waited a few minutes for another train to arrive, and with none forthcoming, he got up and paced the waiting area. He hoped he wouldn't go to all this trouble and then be late to his father's service, and because of this, he assumed that his sister would wait for his arrival. She hadn't revealed the date or the time of the service, but surely she would wait. But how would she know he was even coming? He didn't have her phone number, and she didn't have his. Both were unlisted, or at least his was. He knew, was he sure about hers? Too late in any case. He was on his way, or soon would be, and there hadn't been time to write her a letter. Would they really wait for him before burying his father? It seemed unlikely, after all this time of non-communication. Still, Polk would follow through. The next train came by so slowly, Polk thought it was going to stop. He went out on the platform, ready to board. All the cars were full of smoke. He could see here and there the occasional ashen face among the gray clouds. Were all these people smoking? Was this a train of nothing but smokers in their smoking cars? The train never stopped and left the station without his discovering the answer. He wasn't actually sure his father wanted to be buried. He vaguely remembered some talk of cremation. His mother had been cremated. It had been her wish. Would his father follow suit? 2 more trains passed at such speed, he thought he might have hallucinated their presence. A haunting, drawn-out memory of sound, and then they were gone, leaving behind not even a whiff of their exhaust. He sat back down on the bench and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, another train was passing. He was alarmed at the way it had snuck up on him, making not even a breath or a sigh of sound. Cattle cars, one after another, sheathed in wooden slats, tiny windows at the top. Here and there, the slats had warped, and fingers protruded from the resulting spaces. The fingers moved back and forth as if in admonishment, or simply to maximize their contact with the air. There were sounds coming from the cars he couldn't quite identify. Soft moans, perhaps weeping, or something from a despair far beyond the point of weeping. No more trains appeared for a very long time. Polk was ready to abandon the attempt, even though it meant a long trek back to the isolated, ramshackle structure which he had made his home. It occurred to him that the ticket seller might have cheated him and simply pocketed his money, that indeed trains did not stop here. Why would they? It's such a desolate place. But then there was a sudden roaring sound and something thunderous rolling down the tracks. Polk felt the wall of intense heat before it came into view, car after car completely consumed by flames. There were dark charcoal shapes inside the flames, and these shapes appeared to be moving, but he could not tell whether these were actually people or what had been people, or the collapse of internal furnishings instead. Polk jumped up and ran to the ticket window and began beating on the glass, shouting and begging for that apparently sole employee to do something, anything, to somehow fix this terrible circumstance. Getting no response, he picked up a nearby trash can and used it to beat on the glass. But no matter how hard he struck it, the window would not shatter. He dropped the trash can and ran around the waiting room, jerking open cabinet and closet doors, then out to the front of the building, looking for some hose or some kind of fire extinguisher. He found nothing. He walked back into the station only to discover that another train had arrived. now waiting at the platform, the doors open. He hesitated only briefly, then raced through the opening before he or it could reconsider. The doors closed behind him with a snapping sound. This particular car was empty, which pleased him initially, and he sprawled across the wide bench, feeling luxurious, although the bench in fact was not that comfortable. Both the seat and back were rock hard, and soon enough he found himself fidgeting, moving around, seeking some sort of comfort, which was not there. Finally, he sat up straight and focused on the passing countryside. This was the one part of the journey back into his father's influence that Polk had been looking forward to. When he left his father's house, it was in the middle of the night in an automobile that barely ran. He had made his goodbyes with no one, and he'd been so concerned that his vehicle might break down, he paid very little attention to the passing countryside. And what he did see, he could not trust. Anger and upset often made him see the unexplainable. He was anxious now to see normal beings in their native habitat, performing their daily rituals, doing the things which all good people felt they had to do. But after an hour or so, Polk realized he was to be disappointed. The train tracks veered far from most developed areas, and when the train did come near a town, he searched the streets for the inhabitants to no avail. Perhaps it was a holiday. He had not kept up with the usual calendrical landmarks in some time. Not that he felt completely alone out there. He did see the signs of human activity, trucks and cars moving on distant highways, other trains, a large tractor or two plowing or whatever such machines do. But he wasn't close enough to see the drivers or any other human beings around. Automation seemed a distant and unlikely possibility. It had only been a scattering of years since last he came this way. There had been a population then. There had to be one now. Polk stood up and proceeded to explore the rest of the train. There was no one in the first few cars, but he had determined, based on a look out his window as the train wrapped around a wide curve, that his car was near the end, and perhaps the forward cars were considered more desirable. He did not know that this was so, but it certainly seemed plausible. Polk traveled from car to car and actually enjoyed those more unsteady sections between cars where the floors bounced up and down. He proceeded up the train until he reached a locked door near the engine and could proceed no further. Perhaps he had figured incorrectly, and in fact he was progressing away from the more desirable train cars. He retraced his steps until he had reached the car he had originally entered, and a good thing since he discovered he had left his ticket behind on the seat. Retrieving his ticket, he passed through the car and worked his way toward the end of the train, where he was stopped by another locked door after passing through a dozen or more empty cars. All the cars were empty. Polk was the only passenger on board. He returned to his seat and tried to relax into the inevitability of it. This had been his decision, of course. All his decisions had led him here to this particular empty train. He refused to have any regrets. The train bent its way around another long curve, and gazing out the window, he could see that it was approaching another station. He stood up, curious, and pressed his face against the glass. As the train entered the station, he had the peculiar sensation that everything was speeding up around him, and yet he, in his car, at this window, remained still for a time. So as the train passed the platform, he was able to remain motionless and get a good, long look into that platform and at whoever might be waiting on the benches inside. An old man sat by himself on the bench, dressed in a familiar gray suit and hunched over a battered suitcase Polk would have recognized anywhere. The fool thought he could actually take a bag where he was going. It was his father, who now raised a bottle of whiskey to his lips, but the bottle proved empty, and the old man threw it at the train in disgust. Polk laughed and waved his hands. He jumped up and down, and before his train finally whipped him away, he saw the old man's so pale look of alarm. Thank you.